Order. Order. Would everyone ensure that all electronic devices are turned off or switched to the silent mode? Tea and coffee are not allowed in the committee room. And I remind members that interventions should be short and raise points of clarifications or questions. They should not be speeches in and of themselves. Members who do wish to give a speech should bob and continue to do so throughout the debate they wish to speak in until they are called. And when members say you, they are referring to the chair. You should not be used to refer to each other. Debate should come through the chair. We now come to Amendment 525 to Clause 32 in the name of Danny Kruger, with which it will be convenient to consider Amendments 528, 537, 529, 530, Clause 32 Stand Part Amendment 545, New Clause 36, Amendment A to E to New Clause 36, and New Clause 37. I call Danny Kruger to move Amendment 525.
Thank you very much, Mr. McVeigh. It's very good to serve under you on what's probably our last day in the committee. And let me start by acknowledging that we're going to be rejecting Clause 32 in due course, I fully expect. So while I want to move my Amendment 525, no intention of pushing it or any of these other amendments to a vote. But I do want to take the opportunity to address the clause and indeed to speak to the amendment which is tabled in my name. And this clause was always going to be an important one, Madam Chair, because it allowed the government to provide money to fund the assistance to die. And it would have allowed the Secretary of State to make financial arrangements to secure the provision of assistance under the bill. And I think what we might have been debating if we were going to be sticking with this bill, and I think it's still worth acknowledging and invite the honourable member and people who support the bill to speak to this point. The bill allowed, and indeed will in future require the government to fund the provision of assisted suicide services, but it makes no provision to fund the supply of palliative care. And we all, I think, in this committee recognise the absolute imperative of a properly supported palliative care sector, and I deeply regret that while the government is supporting a resourcing of this new service, there is no balancing commitment to provide what we've all acknowledged is the essential corollary of any assisted dying service. But worse, in this clause and in the new clause which will replace it, we have something different. And last Thursday night, just as the committee rose, the member for Spen Valley tabled Amendment 538, which will remove this clause from the bill, the clause which committed the Secretary of State to make the financial commitments which were debated in principle when the House debated the money resolution on the 22nd of January. And once again, I regret that important undertakings that were made on behalf of the bill by the government and by the Honourable Lady have since, in the course of the debate subsequent to the second reading, now subsequent to the money resolution, been superseded by further provisions. Now, Amendment 538 is consequential on two new clauses. New Clause 37, which will allow the Welsh ministers to set up a system to implement the bill in Wales. Now, this gives very wide powers to Welsh ministers, including the powers to make provision about the service that would be outside the legislative competence of Welsh ministers, which I think is significant. But unlike Clause 32 and New Clause 36, which will replace it, New Clause 37 does not make any reference to the health service in Wales. And I think it's worth us teasing out the challenge to the devolution settlement that this new clause represents, and I'm sure the Honourable Lady will be speaking to that. But, Madam Chair, I want to speak briefly, but I hope clearly and powerfully, to the essential challenge that this new clause represents. And without getting too involved in the party politics of this, we all talk about our NHS. And in a sense, it is our NHS, this nation's great domestic institution, created in the 20th century in response to the absolutely shamefully inequitable provision of healthcare that preceded 1946. And while Labour rightly claim the credit for having introduced the NHS under the Attlee government, in fact the Liberals have a good claim to it. It was the Liberal, Beveridge, who first advocated the provision of a National Health Service. And what's not enough recognised, so I'm sure my honourable friends on this side are proud to say, it was a Conservative Health Secretary who first put before the House of Commons a plan for a National Health Service, Henry Willink, Health Secretary in the wartime coalition government. Unfortunately, the public voted us out of power in 1945, and it fell to Labour to implement a slightly different plan. But nevertheless, I think we can all claim some parentage of this great institution, the NHS. And that's why it is so significant that in these new clauses which we're debating now, a fundamental change to the NHS in England is proposed. Now, the duty on the Secretary of State under the National Health Service Act of 1946, as updated in 2006, is to promote in England, I quote, a comprehensive health service designed to secure improvement in the physical and mental health of the people of England and in the prevention, diagnosis and treatment of physical and mental illness. This has been the purpose of the NHS since 1946. And I find it curious, Madam Chair, that there's a linguistic sleight of hand being practiced in this new clause. This new phrase, VAD services, voluntary assisted dying services, is introduced, and it's used to avoid having to spell out that subsection 1 of the NHS Act will now include references to, I quote, assistance to end the lives of people in England and Wales, which is the language of the bill as introduced. It's in the long title, and it's in nearly every clause up to this point. The explicit language that this is about ending people's lives, that is avoided in the new clause. And why is that? And I do put it to the committee that it's a hard thing to do, to take a red pen to Bevan's legacy, to fundamentally change the NHS from one, quote, designed to secure improvement in the physical and mental health of the people of England and Wales, dedicated to prevention, diagnosis and treatment of illness, and to add into that founding clause of the NHS the words, and end the lives of terminally ill people. So I'll be blunter than the drafters have been. This clause changes the NHS from the National Health Service to the National Health and Assisted Suicide Service. That is the direct implication of the clause that we are debating. Furthermore, it does so in the same clause that is designed not only to fundamentally alter the National Health Service, but also to enable the private sector to be paid from NHS funds to end the lives of terminally ill people. And not only that, but to do so with a Henry VIII power, so broad as to enable any changes within the NHS or any law to facilitate this goal. Now, happy to give way.
Would he accept that end-of-life care is also part of the NHS? And that has always been part of the NHS, and that is not promoting health, it's enabling a good death.
Danny Kruger.
I'm grateful. No, I fundamentally disagree. End-of-life care is healthcare. It addresses the symptoms, it addresses the conditions, and it is designed in a way that is completely compatible with the founding principle of the NHS. Whereas, as we've seen from this bill, and I appreciate the honesty of the drafters, even if they're not quite spelling it out, that they recognise that what is proposed, an assisted suicide service, is not compatible with the founding principles of the NHS, which is why it is required to adapt that the founding section of the original founding clause of the NHS. And of course I recognise that end-of-life care is healthcare and it's completely compatible with what the NHS does. I wish it were more part of the NHS. It's another debate to have, actually. Of course it should have been. Palliative care should have been more closely integrated into NHS provision, and it still should be. Now, I think I just want to tease out briefly I think a tension within the drafters and the advocates of this bill about exactly how the assisted suicide service would be facilitated and provided. We've got a bit closer to it, though some questions still remain, which is regrettable because here we are on the very last day of the committee's debate. But last month, the member for Spen Valley told the committee this is not assisted suicide by the state. The state is not involved. I'm perplexed by that, but I think many members of the public would not agree with that analysis of where this bill has evolved during the committee stage. If it was intended not to involve the state in the provision of this service, then that's not the bill we have. in contradiction to that, and I think more accurately, the Minister for Social Care told us that the bill promoter's intent, speaking for the bill, for the member for Spen Valley, her, I quote, intent is to ensure that the assisted dying service is available as an integral part of the NHS. He said, officials are working on amendments to later clauses to establish the operating model for her consideration, which is clearly what has happened, and this is where we are now. He said that her intent is to ensure that the assisted dying service is available as an integral part of the NHS. However, I'm sorry to say that I don't feel that the operating model is now clear. We still don't have an impact assessment. We don't know how the government envisages it actually working in practice. And we have important information still lacking for the debate today. We don't know the possible impact on general practice, on medical specialists, nor how it might impact money that's available for palliative care. So I hope the Minister can tell us more today about how he envisages the treatment, the service being implemented, and especially in light of the motion supported by the BMA conference earlier this month, when, they supported the motion that assisted dying is not health activity and it must not take place in NHS or other health facilities. Principle I agree with. Now, on the 5th of March, the Honourable Member for Spen Valley said, I quote, there is no expectation that assisted dying would be set up as a private enterprise or service. It would be delivered within the provision of the NHS, now agreeing with the Minister. Fine, interesting. So it's to be an NHS service, not to be provided privately. But the new clause that she's tabled does not rule out private provision, nor does it rule out any profit making by providers or remuneration of people outside the NHS. Indeed, this new clause refers to voluntary assisted dying services, which suggests that the Honourable Member is supportive of services outside the NHS commissioned services, which will be possible indeed under subclauses 1, 3 and 7a. And that will be in line with comments made by my right honourable friend, who made, I think, a very coherent case for private provision of assisted suicide, if that's what Parliament chooses to legalise. He said nothing should prevent someone opting for private provision. And indeed, in response, the member for Spen Valley said this service, like many others, will be delivered through a range of providers. So I remain unclear about the extent to which this is, as it were, an NHS monopoly, whether there will be private provision privately paid for, whether there will be private provision publicly paid for. And I'd be very grateful for her clarification. And lastly, on the question of profit, in an article in the Times which appeared to have some briefing behind it, there was a suggestion that there would be a cap on the profit of private companies providing the service, limited to making a reasonable profit. Again, nothing in the new clause about limitations on the profit provided. And if the member could clarify how she envisages the private provision of the service, I would be grateful. Thank you, Chair.
Sean Woodcock.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to serve under your chair. I rise to move amendment new clause 36B, tabled by my honourable friend, the member for Shipley. The amendment states that regulations under subsection 1 may not amend, modify or repeal section 1 of the National Health Service Act 2006. For clarity, I will read out the relevant part of section 1 of the 2006 Act. The Secretary of State must continue the promotion in England of a comprehensive health service designed to secure improvement, A, in the physical and mental health of the people of England, and B, in the prevention, diagnosis and treatment of physical and mental illness. These core principles have remained the same since the National Health Service Act in 1946. As the member for East Wiltshire stated, in a Britain that was devastated by war, Clement Attlee and Nye Bevan together promised a better future, one where healthcare should be available to all, regardless of wealth. It enshrined the principle that as a society, we will care for the ill and we will do it together. No one's health should be left behind, especially the vulnerable. The NHS stands as the greatest legacy of a Labour government, despite the input of opposition parties referred to by the Honourable Member for East Wiltshire, and indeed perhaps of any government since the Second World War. The establishment of the NHS lives on in section 1 of that Act. It is why, during the height of the COVID pandemic, NHS staff courageously put themselves on the front line to protect us. It was their mission to secure improvement in the physical and mental health of all, free at the point of service. As we consider assisted dying, we must not lose the values at the heart of the NHS. Section 1 of the NHS Act has changed little from the corresponding first section of the 1946 Act. It is not just a line in legislation, it has become part of our national story and our national identity. This amendment is about continuing that. It seeks to preserve the legacy of Attlee and Bevan and that of Labour governments committed to the betterment of the people. 25 senior doctors and pharmacists from the Orkney Islands spoke of this legacy in their written evidence. Quote, "We note with pride the founding principles of the NHS, with the 1946 National Health Service Act stating, it shall be the duty of the Minister of Health to promote the establishment in England and Wales of a comprehensive health service designed to secure improvement in the physical and mental health of the people of England and Wales and the prevention, diagnosis and treatment of illness. We believe that Parliament must reflect the lasting ethos of our founding document." There are very few lines in legislation that come to represent an institution in this way. It is a testament to the ideal of those founding principles in Section 1 that they guide doctors to this very day. This is the thread that runs through the 1946 NHS Act to the 2006 National Health Service Act. Two Labour governments in 60 years apart, united by this mission to improve the physical and mental health of the people. I believe this committee should continue the thread of those principles. Of course, I understand that previous legislation may need to be amended to provide assisted dying services. That may include the 2006 National Health Service Act. Subsection 4 clarifies that specified references to commissioned voluntary dying services may be included in that Act. I note with regret that this new clause gives us so little information elsewhere about the use of these powers. These are commonly known as Henry VIII powers, or Henry VIII clauses. I will admit that this was not a term I was familiar with until very, very recently. I'm sure that other members are much more familiar with it than myself, and I wait for an intervention, then none come. On the off chance that there are one or two members who need a reminder, however, I will just quote Parliament's own official definition of the term. Henry VIII clauses are clauses in a bill that enable ministers to amend or repeal provisions in an Act of Parliament used in secondary legislation, which is subject to varying degrees of parliamentary scrutiny. And it says, rather helpfully, the expression is a reference to King Henry VIII's supposed preference for legislating directly by proclamation rather than through Parliament. Now, I accept it might be rather odd to talk about Henry VIII in this debate, but we shouldn't let that distract us from the serious question that this clause involves. This new clause could bring a significant transfer of power from members of this House to the Secretary of State, and it's not clear what this power will be used for. As the Hansard Society's commented, there is little indication about what role or nature these powers will take. I quote, "A key principle that the House of Lords Constitution Committee has applied to delegated powers is that they, quote, should not be framed in such a way that gives little indication of how they should be used. The Delegated Powers and Regulatory Reform Committee's guidance to departments states that the Delegated Powers Memorandum should set out how it is proposed that the power should be exercised." So I would be grateful if the Honourable Friend from Spen Valley and the Ministers could provide some clarity on these questions. Subclause 1 does not specify that voluntary assisted dying be provided on the NHS, but subclause 4 allows for the National Health Service Act to be amended. I'd ask what is the intention of these powers? What will the structure of the voluntary assisted dying service be? How will it be funded and who will be responsible for the provision of these services? Answer to these questions will inform which legislation needs to be amended, and that information should be on the face of the bill. To be clear, as I've said, I accept that changes to previous legislation may be required. However, the provision of assisted dying should not amend the foundational principles of the National Health Service. It should not break with the legacy of Attlee, of Bevan, of Labour. And that's why I'm moving this amendment today. I also want to speak in support of Amendment New Clause 36C and New Clause 36D, tabled by the Honourable Member for Richmond Park. Amendment New Clause 36C prohibits the private provision of assisted dying. Instead, it places responsibility for that provision on public authorities. I have a number of practical concerns about private providers, but I would like to start with the question of accountability for assisted dying. Should Parliament pass this legislation, it will bring a profound change to the role of the state, and I don't think that's in any dispute across this committee. I think everyone's very well aware of how important this piece of legislation is as a piece of legislation. We must not make such a significant decision only to delegate it to private providers. The risks are too great. This is not simply a question of principle or consistency within the bill. It is about establishing that proper accountability for assisted dying. The state must oversee and regulate the delivery of this enormous legislative and social change. It must remain visible. Public authorities like the NHS are directly accountable to Parliament and to the government. Assisted dying must have that same accountability to Parliament and to the government. Private bodies are not accountable to the state, to government or to the public in the same way as public bodies. For example, private services are subject to fewer checks and regulations than public ones. There can be less transparency about organisational structure, recruitment and finances. We've been assured that data collection and monitoring would safeguard the implementation of this legislation. But without uniform standards and clear ways of enforcing them across providers, the monitoring of this legislation will be limited, even with the best will in the world. The best way to establish those uniform standards would be to provide assisted dying through public authorities. There is also the risk of developing a patchwork of private providers with variable standards. Organisations may develop slightly different practices, guidelines and reputations. This could create an uneven framework, preventing the establishment of best practice across services. I'd like to reiterate that this places the public at risk. More than happy to give way.
Oh, I'd like to thank the honourable member. He's making a very reasoned speech. The only thing here is that actually already the way the NHS is delivered is very complex. So, for example, GPs are private providers who are on a contract with the NHS. And so I think if we pass legislation here to completely ban private providers, this will not in any way enhance the bill, and it will actually create a situation where almost no doctors can get involved. So I do believe that we need to keep the private aspect just simply so that the NHS can control what's going on, but the providers of that can be from independent organisations.
Sean Woodcock.
I thank my honourable friend for his intervention. I'm afraid I just don't agree. My view is that if we're going to do this, it should be via the NHS. And as somebody who stood on a Labour election platform not too long ago, I don't mind wearing that as something that I stand by. We know that geography and socio-economic factors render access to healthcare, private healthcare, especially unequal. In oral evidence, Baroness Kishwa Faulkner, head of the Equalities and Human Rights Commission, and Fazlet Hadi of Disability Rights UK, both explained how the impacts of this bill on an unequal society might cause problems. Baroness Faulkner said, "From what one understands, GP provision and general access to healthcare are poorer where demographics are poorer than it is in the better performing parts of the country. One other factor to consider in terms of a postcode lottery is that people in wealthier parts of the country tend to be more highly represented in private healthcare than in public healthcare and the use of the NHS. That also impacts their choices and the care that they get." I'd also say that this system must not only be fair, it must be seen to be fair. If we had such a system of private provision in place, then public trust would almost certainly fall. We do not have to look far to see what happens if these matters are unaddressed. When we have a lack of oversight and accountability, it is the public who suffer. There are too many scandals in recent history for us not to recognise that reality. One of the big factors in the Post Office Horizon scandal was that Fujitsu, the supplier of specialist computer software, did not admit when it knew things were going wrong. Now, I'm not saying that the public sector is perfect, far from it. I've spent much of my working life working in it, but it is an example that teaches us a very important lesson. Sometimes private companies will not share information that could mean they lose a lucrative contract. They do not have the same oversight as public authorities, who are ultimately accountable to the government, the parliament and, through them, the public. We must give the public reason to trust that assisted dying services will have proper oversight. Otherwise, the consequence will be felt not just in the provision of assisted dying, but also in healthcare more generally. How does this amendment address some of those risks? It establishes that the voluntary assisted dying services must be provided by a public authority. Further, a body contracted by a public authority to provide this service must be a public authority. The definition of a public authority is a body substantially publicly funded which performs statutory duties, objectives and other actions consistent with central or local government functions. It is clear that public authorities have stronger mechanisms for transparency and for reporting. Requiring assisted dying provision through public bodies also places the responsibility firmly with the state. This allows direct implementation of regulations and guidelines on the provision of assisted dying. Best practice is easier to establish when the regulations apply to the same types of organisations. What happened to give way?
I thank my honourable friend for allowing my intervention and pleasure to serve on your chairship today, Chair. In similar circumstances into the provision of quite very intense personal services, would he say that, for example, in the current provision of IVF services, there are a range of providers, some in the private sector, some in the public sector, and in fact most are in the private sector, even if they're delivering under an NHS funding or contract or whatever. But they're all subject to the same rules, inspection and regulation. So does he not accept that if it could work in a very intense and personal and sometimes ethically complex situation, it could equally map across because there's experience in that sort of environment?
Sean Woodcock.
Well, my honourable friend's intervention, I accept it could work. My view is it is far less likely to work and it's more likely to be successful if it is wholly under public authority responsibility. I now move on to speak to the second amendment in this group, Amendment NC36D, which I will be voting in favour of. The amendment removes the provision that the regulations under this section may make any provision that could be made by an Act of Parliament, but they may not amend this Act. Providing the Secretary of State can amend primary legislation strikes me as dangerous to include in the Act, and we should vote to remove it. This power is surely a weakening of the Bill's safeguards. Assisted dying must remain firmly in the control of the democratically elected Parliament. I would urge members to join me in voting to remove the subsection. If we fail to rule out the possibility of private provision, if we allow the power that means the Secretary of State can amend primary legislation, then we're failing to implement necessary safeguards. The honourable members' amendments go some way to addressing that. They ensure that the state which sanctions assisted dying is also the body that provides it. Assisted dying services need strong reporting and accountability. Otherwise, we risk inequality or abuse of assisted dying to go unchecked. Providing assisted dying through public authorities is essential to proper accountability, reporting and best practice, and so I would urge members of the committee to support. Thank you.
Sarah Olney.
Thank you very much, Ms McVeigh. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. Now, in Richmond Park, a Henry VIII power has traditionally meant the right of the monarch to hunt the deer in the large open space that gives my constituency its name. Something I'm sorry to say he has in common with the member for East Watch's dog. But the paid a hefty fine, I think. The efforts of the King's descendants to try and enclose the park and maintain those powers for the exclusive benefit of the royal family were defeated by a popular, somewhat genteel uprising by the residents of Richmond. And I stand here today as a member for Richmond Park to do a similar job, to assert the rights of the House of Commons, the Houses of Parliament, to determine what legislation is, and not to allow it to be delegated under Henry VIII powers. So the normal approach is that legislation made by ministers is delegated legislation, and such legislation is therefore of subsidiary character to primary legislation. However, there's a type of power, known as Henry VIII powers, which gives ministers the power to amend even primary legislation. And the glossary on Parliament's website says, the expression is a reference to King Henry VIII's supposed preference for legislating directly by proclamation rather than through Parliament. We may, in the course of time, start to refer to this as President Trump powers, who knows, but that's the precedent that we act on. The Hansard Society, a non-partisan organisation who are neutral on assisted dying, issued a report that was critical of this power, and they said this: little can be deduced about how it is thought that this power be used in practice, beyond the fact that it may, in particular, be used to enable the provision of assisted deaths through the National Health Service. But as the Delegated Powers and Regulatory Reform Committee have previously stated, where a power provides that delegated legislation may, in particular, include a specified matter, it implies that the legislation may deal with matters beyond that specified matter. The explanatory note shed little more light, except to clarify that the power could be used to make arrangements for the funding of any provision made by the regulations. Could the regulations thus be used to enable the provision of assistance through the private sector on behalf of the health service in England and in Wales? If the intention is that the regulations will be used only to establish an assisted dying service, either within or separately to the NHS, would they require that the service be free at the point of access to the person requesting assistance? A key principle that the House of Lords Constitution Committee has applied to delegated powers is that they should not be framed in such a way that gives little indication of how they should be used. The DPRRC's guidance to departments states that the Delegated Powers Memorandum should set out how it is proposed that a power should be exercised. In the current absence of a Delegated Powers Memorandum, MPs may therefore wish to seek clarification from the sponsor of the bill, the member for Spen Valley, about how she envisages the power being used, and similarly from ministers how they expect to use this power if it were granted to them. The drafter of the bill, Dame Elizabeth Gardner, appeared on the Hansard Society podcast and gave some further detail on this power and how it arose. In other areas, such as, is it going to be delivered through the National Health Service or in some other way, indeed the regulation of any substances that might be involved, in the time available, we didn't have time to go into all the detail of how these regimes would work and to make the provision on the face of the bill. And so there are regulation-making powers there which enable that provision to be set out in detail, as you say, when the government has looked at it and decided how it would implement it. Given the time available and the constraints of the private members' bill process, the member for Spen Valley can be forgiven for not including the detail of how this will be provided on the NHS on the face of the bill at introduction. But she and the government have now had months to think about this. I think many people had hoped that Clause 32 would be replaced with detailed arrangements for the delivery of this service to be made on the face of the bill by way of amendment which this committee could then properly scrutinise. Indeed, on the 5th of March, the member for Spen Valley repeatedly said all be made clear by Clause 32. When the member for East Wiltshire called for clarity in the bill as to how the service would be delivered, the sponsor said, it will be. And the minister said, officials are working on amendments to later clauses to establish the operating model for her consideration. This does not appear to have happened. It means that Parliament will be limited to a 90-minute debate on this issue when those regulations are eventually made, and such a motion would be unamendable. Surely the issue of how this service is to be delivered is much more important than this and deserves greater scrutiny. So it's disappointing to see NC 36 and NC 37 as the replacement clauses. Instead of those clauses, ideally we would have had a detailed set of amendments which would specify exactly how assisted dying is to be delivered. We do not have that, and instead we have a Henry VIII power, which is even more power than the one in Clause 32, as this new one includes a power to modify Acts of Parliament which have been passed subsequently to this. And NC 36 provides very little guidance on how the Henry VIII power would be exercised. Will it be provided by the state? And if so, would it be on the NHS or through another body? Subclause 1 does not specify it must be on the NHS. Subclause 4 gives the power but not the duty to change Section 1 of the NHS Act, a foundational piece of Labour legislation if there ever was one, as referenced by the member for Banbury. But subclause 5 requires it to be free at the point of use. The question of whether it should be provided as part of normal NHS services or in a parallel service as requested by both the BMA and the Royal College of GPs is not answered by NC 36, though hopefully it can be fleshed out in the debate on the amendments in the name of the member for East Wiltshire. Alternatively, it would seem that the power can be used to commission private providers to deliver this service on behalf of the state. But instead of deciding between these various models, NC 36 simply leaves it open. The new clause therefore gives very little indication about how it should be used. Lord Falconer, when giving the Gray's Inn reading at Gresham College last year, said, the wider the power, because there is less material in primary legislation to define how it should be exercised, the greater the reduction in parliamentary scrutiny. but also the harder it will be to identify any legal basis of challenge. He went as far as to suggest that such wide Henry VIII powers were unconstitutional. Given his great support for the bill, it would be interesting to hear the response of the member for Spen Valley and of the Minister to Lord Falconer's remarks. Now, despite the Parliamentary Business and Legislation Committee Guide to Making Legislation, at paragraph 45.25, requiring an impact assessment of the bill prior to second reading, we do not have that. We did not even get an impact assessment at the beginning of committee stage. Now, the justification given was that the bill could change. I accept the bill has changed, significantly with the removal of the High Court safeguard. In my view, this change has made the bill weaker. However, in other respects, the bill has not changed very much at all. The role of the doctors is the same as before. There's been no change on the issue of how it will be delivered by the state. New Clause 36 does not provide us with any further clarity than Clause 32 did. So if there was insufficient detail to do an impact assessment based on Clause 32, why is there now sufficient detail to do one in respect of New Clause 36? I fear that the impact assessment might not be terribly useful. I would hope that the Minister could give us a detailed impact assessment under all three models: delivery by the NHS, delivery by a new assisted dying agency, and delivery through third-party contractors. But until a clear decision is made on those, I accept that the impact assessment cannot be as detailed. That's the problem. By failing to make a decision, we are kicking the can down the road. If we do not decide today, the decision will have to be made by Parliament in a 90-minute debate on a motion that cannot be amended. My Amendment E to New Clause 36 would require that prior to such a debate, an impact assessment be published, and that this impact assessment explains the impact on the healthcare and NHS workforce. We have a limited number of healthcare professionals. There are huge NHS waiting lists, and we've all experienced difficulties in getting a GP appointment. A doctor having to book out a whole day to stay with a patient whilst they ingest a lethal substance is a doctor who cannot be with other patients. Whether this is provided on the NHS, as part of another agency, or by private providers, the issue is the same. It's a doctor who would not be seeing other patients. This is a trade-off that will need to be made. I hope that ministers can be open about this. I would have hoped that ministers would have been open about this trade-off at second reading, or even now. And my amendment would ensure that at least before voting on the particular model, following only 90 minutes of debate, the House could see those clearly. I fear this would be too little too late, but it's still better than nothing, and so I hope my amendment will be supported. I'll say more about the particular situation in Wales when we come to my Amendment 535 to Clause 42, but I fear that New Clause 37 does not address the devolution issue. Firstly, it completely fails to do the analysis of which matters are devolved and which matters are reserved, something which the Minister said on the 5th of March to the Honourable Member for Merioneth, nearly, I beg your pardon, should be done on a clause-by-clause basis. Here, the new Clause 37 simply kicks the can down the road again by giving a very wide Henry VIII power to the Welsh ministers in respect of what is devolved, and a very wide Henry VIII power to the Secretary of State in respect of what is reserved, but it totally fails to identify which is which. Suppose, following the vote in the Senate, that the Welsh ministers do not wish to implement assisted dying in Wales, but the Secretary of State decides to use his powers on reserved matters to enable it to the extent he can. What will the effect of that be? Would it not create a real legal uncertainty? There is a real risk that if the Senate does not want assisted dying in Wales, we end up with a position where it is decriminalised and unregulated and not commissioned in Wales. That would not be a sustainable solution, and the effect would be that the Welsh Government may feel they have no real choice in the matter. The better solution is therefore to have, as Professor Emyr Lewis suggested, different commencement provisions for England and Wales. I don't want to preempt this debate, but this is why I don't feel that New Clause 37 is an adequate solution. Turning to my amendment NC 36C, this specifies that if a public authority contracts for the provision of voluntary assisted dying, it must be with another public authority. It places a block on outsourcing this incredibly sensitive service to private providers. There are two basic principles. First, provision should be by public sector organisations because they are subject to greater oversight and scrutiny and are more likely to be held to account. This is not about distrusting private enterprise, it's about recognising the stakes here demand the highest level of public oversight. We've only to look to the findings of the Patterson inquiry to understand the risk of failures in oversight, how Spire Healthcare lacked robust governance, and Patterson operated with little scrutiny, exploiting laxer regulations in private settings, while patients assumed NHS-level standards applied, unaware of the accountability gap. The second principle is equally critical. NHS funding must not be diverted to external organisations that profit from or are sustained by the business of ending lives. Every pound spent on healthcare is a pound fought for by taxpayers, by clinicians, by patients, to direct that money into the coffers of private providers whose incentives might lean towards efficiency over compassion risks betraying the NHS's founding ethos. We cannot allow a system where the end of life becomes a revenue stream, where the decision to die is shaped, however subtly, by a balance sheet rather than a patient's free will. Happy to give way.
It's been referred to, thank you, Chair. It's been referred to about the position of IVF. My wife and I are people who've been through IVF, and of course what exists is exactly what was provided. An annual show at Olympia where people can be commercialised, and that put to them, why don't you go down this route, why don't you go down that route? So would the member agree with me that that's really not a route we want to be going down?
Sarah?
I'm really grateful to the member for Bexley Heath and Crayford for that point, because I think it really does, in a sense, it provides a kind of a comparison. That is what we're talking about. We are talking about potentially a market for end-of-life services. I don't think that's the way we should be going. I'm happy to give way.
I'd like to thank the Honourable Member for giving way and for her very impassioned speech as well. But I do feel that we're rather getting off the point with these private and NHS. This is a spurious division in what's happening. It will be delivered by doctors who are working under a code of practice. They will be rewarded for their pay, and as we've said, that will be stipulated by the BMA in contract arrangements with the government. But that will be proportionate, and the doctors will do the work and get the money for that. And there's no difference from that, from IVF or anything else. And I think if we accept that, the NHS will be the commissioning body. They will ensure standards in this way. Sorry, I'm going on a bit long, Chair, but I shall now finish. But I do think it's a spurious division between NHS provided and private. Thank you.
Sarah?
I thank the member for Stroud for that intervention. I think the issue is who is commissioning the service. It's not about the doctors, and it's not about how they are recompensed for the work that they do. That's not the issue. The issue is who's doing the recompensing and what are their incentives. Now, if it's as part of an NHS-provided service where it's agreed that this is a compassionate end-of-life choice and that it is properly regulated within the wider NHS service and connects up with other NHS services, I think that's one thing. If the person commissioning that doctor has any kind of incentive around making a profit. Now, any profit-making organisation is going to be incentivised to try and increase the amount of profits that it makes. And however carefully regulated, there will be subtle, or possibly not so subtle, to take the member for Bexley Heath and Crayford's example, influence, pressure, coercion, persuasion that end of life is that assisted dying is an option for patients that they should choose, and it may not, under other circumstances, have been, under an NHS model, that may not have been a solution that they were being persuaded to choose. So it's about this issue of persuasion, and it's about the issue of incentives that really troubles me. Happy to give way to the member.
Just to emphasise the point, is the Honourable Lady suggesting that doctors who operate in the private sector are less ethical than doctors who operate in the public sector?
Sarah?
I think I said very clearly to the member for Stroud, it is not about the doctors, it is about the people who are commissioning them. I absolutely do not believe that doctors operating in the private sector, and in my experience, often it's the doctors in the private sector are very often the same as the doctors in the NHS. It is precisely about who is commissioning them, who is asking them to carry out this work. And what I am saying is if it's the commissioners are motivated by a profit incentive as opposed to the NHS, which is about providing the best possible care. Happy to give way.
I'm very grateful. I entirely agree with the Honourable Lady. We're all equally ethical and unethical. The point is we respond to incentives, and incentives have their effect. And so, in agreement with the Honourable Lady, does she agree with me that there's a further concern? There's firstly, if we have a tariff system, which we probably would, that by definition creates a market if there's the opportunity for private provision to earn tariffs, to make more money the more assisted deaths that you provide. But furthermore, to the point made by the member for Stroud about the fact that this is all perfectly fine and normal, what about the opportunity to top up the public provision, the tariff that you get from the NHS with your own money, and therefore definitely creating the opportunity for some sort of upmarket arrangement through the additional fees and services that might be provided. And as the Honourable Member said, we could exactly see expos dedicated to providing the most, the most luxury, the most glamorous forms of assisted death, provided through private providers with NHS funding.
Sarah.
I'm grateful to the Honourable Member for that intervention. It's honestly not a prospect I particularly want to reflect upon, but I think it's worth noting the particular risk in assisted dying services is that, as we heard from the oral evidence from the Chief Medical Officer, it's actually really hard to define, firstly, whether an illness is going to be terminal, and secondly, that somebody only has 6 months to live. So there is an element of subjective judgment in terms of assessing who's going to be eligible for assisted dying. And when you align subjective judgment to a profit incentive, I think that could potentially create a serious ethical minefield. And I just want to state absolutely clearly for the record, this is not me questioning the ethics of doctors in any way at all, the ethical standards of doctors or any of the bodies that represent them. It is merely about introducing a profit incentive to this particular issue. And as I say, you could contrast it with something like, for example, the provision of abortion services. Abortion services are clearly only available to pregnant women, but where the qualification, as it were, for this particular service is on a rather more subjective basis, that for me creates a risk. So without this amendment, I'm concerned that this bill permits the commodification of the end-of-life process and pushes what should be a sensitive, careful process towards one that becomes transactional. And it also increases the risk that everything becomes focused on facilitating ending the patient's life rather than supporting the holistic ethos of the NHS in addressing all the patient's needs. So without this amendment, I worry that this bill opens a door to the commodification of death, as the member for East Wiltshire has so graphically anticipated. What should be a careful, compassionate process could slide into something more transactional, a service that's marketed, packaged and sold. And we only need to look to the parallel of care homes to see this danger writ large. In England, social care has been quietly overtaken by for-profit providers. Today, 75% of adult care homes and over 80% of children's homes are run for profit, not by design, not by explicit policy, but by the slow creep of market forces. The Economics Observatory, drawing on studies like Pat Warden et al. 2022, Barron and West 2017, and Bart Mortensen et al. 2022, reveals a stark truth. For-profit care, particularly where private equity is involved, consistently delivers worse outcomes. Similarly, a 2019 BMJ study found that private providers running NHS-funded services had higher rates of complications in procedures like hip replacements compared to NHS trusts. And the focus on cost efficiency can lead to skimping on follow-up care or using less experienced staff. And why does this happen? Profit-seeking behaviour drives cuts to staff, to resources, to time. Now transpose that to assisted dying. Imagine the pressures on a private provider to trim costs, the quality of assessments, how thoroughly are mental health conditions explored, or the risk that something else might be going on. How great is the depth of attention to medical records? What's relevant to the doctor, influenced by the ticking clock, and the check a tick box, that they check a tick box rather than a safeguard? Yeah.
I think it gives away. Thank you, Chair. I think it gives away. She said that she isn't questioning the ethical judgment and practice of doctors, but the comments she's making there really are suggesting otherwise.
Sarah.
Again, I am talking about the companies that are running the service. I'm not questioning the ethics of the doctors involved. I am merely suggesting that, the people who are commissioning the doctors to carry out the service will have their own priorities which are not directly related to the safety or the welfare of patients.
I'm sorry if I'm failing to understand what she's saying, but under the bill as it stands, every single stage is under the supervision of a doctor. Even the final moments are under the supervision of a doctor. So I'm failing to see what the motivations, malign or otherwise, that she seems to be implying generally to the private sector, what their motivations, how they might affect the conduct of the doctors, given that she accepts that doctors are equally ethical within the private and public sector.
Sarah?
Unless she thinks they are pressuring doctors to behave unethically.
Well, I mean, it kind of remains to be seen, clearly, how, since we don't yet know what model we are proposing for the delivery of assisted dying, it remains to be seen. Maybe that will be an outcome. Maybe doctors will feel pressured to deliver an outcome because that is how the model has been set up. And if we have a model that incentivises profits, particularly, particularly if we don't have a similar service within the NHS itself, then it is quite possible that that will happen. It won't necessarily affect the care that doctors are giving to patients at the end of life, but I think the point is we don't know, and we can't fully explore that matter in this committee because we don't have the full clarity of exactly how this is going to be delivered. So we cannot examine the proposed model and identify the potential risks and pitfalls of it. And so it continues to be a very real concern. Maybe doctors will feel that pressure. Maybe that is how the service will be designed, precisely to encourage them, for example, to diagnose someone of having less than 6 months to live, when that becomes it's a slightly more subjective judgment. A different doctor operating under a different system may have come to a different judgment. Happy to give way.
I think my own friend for giving way. I'm just trying to wrap my head around the argument she's making, because we already know that ICBs and other commissioning bodies have incentives given to them when they are commissioning services, and it would be in their interests to diagnose or produce a demand for a service to have that in a particular area. So does she not see that there's already an analogous situation within the NHS? And I don't see how that's any different.
Sarah?
I thank my honourable friend for his intervention, but those incentives are not around creating profit that make money for individuals. It is about directing the way that resources are allocated to ensure that that a broader range of health outcomes are achieved. So that's not. When I talk about a profit incentive, it's an entirely different kind of incentive from the one that he's just happy to give me.
I think it is, I'm grateful. It is a very important debate, this. My concern is that there is a sort of, I'm afraid to say, a naive assumption that the innate goodness of doctors will render them impervious to all the incentives in the system. So, of course, as the Honourable Lady suggests, if it were possible, as I think it is under this bill, for a profit-making organisation, a company, to set itself up to provide the assisted suicide conveyor belts, the pathway through this process, and to earn money, publicly or privately, according to the volume of provision that they enable, then of course we are setting up incentives that would essentially corrupt the doctors who would be required to sign it off. And I regret that my brother-in-law friend has such a optimistic view of human nature that he thinks that no doctor would respond to the incentives in the way that is clearly enabled through the bill. And there are other medical professionals, I'm afraid to say, ethical doctors, who do respond to incentives. I think about the cosmetic surgery industry. Again, I will say, well, I'm not actually, I'm in an intervention. I know it might appear that I'm making a speech, so I'll sit down. But I would be interested in the honourable gentleman's response to the suggestion that even he, the paragon of virtue that he is, might indeed be somehow, might not be entirely resistant to the economic incentives in the system. Is why we have an NHS that explicitly tries to exclude profit-making from the provision of healthcare.
Sarah?
I thank the honourable member for his intervention. I have to say I'm not going to associate myself with his use of the word corrupt. I'm absolutely not implying that in any way at all, and I want to be very, very clear about that. If I could just finish my response, then you can intervene, then the honourable member can intervene on me. But I do think that there is a very grave risk that the most ethical person, if offered money to carry out an action that they are inclined to carry out any way that is part of their professional practice, there is a risk that those incentives drive behaviour that I beg your pardon. Does the honourable member want to make an intervention? There is nevertheless a risk that it drives behaviour that that leads to worse outcomes for patients, specifically in relation to assisted dying. Happily give way to the member for Stroud.
Thank my honourable friend for giving way. Could I just say, though, that there may be an incentive to review a patient for assisted dying. There is absolutely no incentive in this bill to approve assisted dying. So the idea that doctors would approve assisted dying for financial reasons is completely spurious.
Sarah.
I'm grateful to the honourable member for his intervention. As I say, we don't have a model before us that we can fully scrutinise. We don't have a model that we can test for risks. We don't have the opportunity to propose amendments, and nor will we have at any stage the opportunity to propose amendments to address risk. I think there's a serious risk about all the different parts of the system, not just the doctors, being incentivised by private profit. I think that's a risk that we can comprehensively remove by my amendment. If you'll just give me a minute. And that, therefore, that is not a risk. But given that we cannot fully and properly scrutinise the proposed model, this currently is the best we can do. Happy to give way again.
I just really want to point out that there is no incentive to agreeing to assisted dying. There's only incentive to assess for assisted dying. So there's no reason why people would be corrupted into agreeing to assisted dying, because it wouldn't mean they would get any more money.
Sarah.
We don't have the model to scrutinise, and we don't know within that model whether either the first coordinating doctor or the second coordinating doctor are going to be paid for their services in carrying out those initial assessments. So to say that you're not going to be incentivised for making the final decision ignores the fact that people might well be incentivised for making those initial decisions, and that's where the professional judgment is required and may well differ between different doctors, and that's why there's a risk.
Thank you, Jack. I think clause 40, subsection 4, is very clear that medical practitioners can only be receive reasonable remuneration for the provision of services. So it's very clear that they cannot make money from the provision of assisted dying. And is she saying that whether this is a private provider or a private provider commissioned through the NHS, which is the model as set out in the bill, what about hip operations? Is she saying that there is an incentive, a financial incentive for doctors to do more hip operations or more knee operations or other things? I mean, this is a question of the model of public and private healthcare as it stands. It's not a question about assisted dying.
Sarah.
To go to her point about to the honourable member's comment about clause 40, reasonable. We know that's a fairly elastic term. We will find in time that reasonable comes to have its own its own kind of accepted definition, but it doesn't preclude the word reasonable doesn't preclude a profit margin in there. Happy to take further intervention if you think it.
I mean, I would argue that it does.
But it doesn't say that.
Sarah.
It doesn't say that. It doesn't say that the payment to the doctor, should not include, any consideration of profit. To the point about hip operations, you would only have a hip operation if you needed a hip operation. My point is that, an assisted dying is one of a range of options at the end of life, as is being presented here. And the concern is that people motivated by a profit incentive would be incentivised to push that at the expense of options for the patient that don't attract the same level of reward. So that's the issue. Like I say, this is not it's not a binary decision in the way that most treatments are.
Must I give way?
Happy to give way.
I'm grateful. Just in response to the Honourable Lady's point, I mean, in many healthcare systems around the world, the scenario that she paints is exactly the one that is the problem, particularly in American healthcare systems, where doctors are incentivised to deliver volumes of treatments and procedures which are often not actually strictly necessary. And we do have a problem even with our own system of over-prescription of certain medical treatments, particularly pharmaceuticals. So I'm afraid to say incentives do apply. Doctors are subject to them, and we do our best to regulate this out of the system, and it's one of the great advantages of the NHS as it stands, that in comparison with other healthcare systems, we do manage to prevent the over-provision of services in response to economic incentives. It's a founding principle of the NHS, which I'm afraid to say we're overriding with this.
Sarah.
Thank you, Chair. I just want to conclude my remarks just to say I'm just observing that I think the only reason we're looking at contracting out to a private provider in the provision of assisted dying services is simply that the country isn't ready for this. We know how overstretched and under-resourced our NHS is, and we are looking at cutting corners in the bill and in our policy making and in our scrutiny of this legislation and in how this legislation and this service is being delivered. Thank you, Chair.
Nasha.
Thank you, Chair. It's interesting to follow the Honourable Member for her speech, because I'm speaking to the amendment tabled by my Honourable friend for Shipley, Amendment 537, Chair, which goes further than the Honourable Member just has in terms of local authorities, but actually talks about charities. So it concerns both the National Health Service and the provision of healthcare by charities. The Honourable Member for Shipley knows both these fields extremely well. She was the Director of Quality and Strategy and Chief Analyst at the Department of Health, and then had a senior role at the Centre for Ageing Better. Her amendment would mean that assisted dying services could only be provided by charitable organisations and not by the National Health Service. I strongly support the general principle that if we do have assisted dying, it should be free at the point of use. If this House decides that people do indeed have the right to an assisted death under the conditions this bill sets out, then it should not be something limited to those that cannot afford private health care. There are, however, strong objections among general practitioners to providing assisted dying as part of their services. I don't think we should plan to have private firms work under contract for NHS to provide assisted dying either. The Royal College of General Practitioners said in written evidence, and I quote, "Any assisted dying service should be seen as a standalone specialised service that healthcare professionals may opt to provide with additional training and should not be deemed core GP work." The Royal College's advice, which is founded on the views of their members, means that we should give very strong consideration to put assisted dying outside the normal workings of the NHS. If we do that, it seems to me there are a few options. One is for the Secretary of State to invite firms and private firms to tender for contracts and administer assisted dying services. And as I said, there are very strong reasons why I think we should not plan to have private firms work under contract for the NHS to provide assisted dying. I think that is that for me, I feel it is one of the worst options of the possible options that we've got. Another option is for the NHS to fund a specialised assisted dying service that would be separate from the services of other functions. This, I think, potentially could be feasible, but I could also represent that could also represent a significant cost for the NHS, because we still have not had the impact assessment from the government, and we have no idea how significant that cost may be. There is also the worry that if assisted dying becomes available on the NHS, some people will become too frightened to access palliative care, as outlined by Dr. Jamila to this committee. I'll read a brief part of her written evidence to the committee. After talking to the patients in ethnic minority and other disadvantaged groups, she said, overwhelmingly, racialised communities expressed deep concerns that they would be more likely to be pushed towards assisted dying through systemic biases and societal attitudes about those whose lives are valued. Dr. Hussain went on, while safeguards were acknowledged, many remained sceptical that they would be applied fairly and equitably, fearing that vulnerable individuals, particularly those who lack strong advocates or English proficiency, might be at greater risk of being guided towards assisted dying rather than offered appropriate care options. And I would share with the committee, like we do, we often get taxis to and from work and home, and I got into a cab yesterday, and the chap who was driving was a chap called Dave. His aunt died literally on Friday. She was an 84-year-old. And when we were discussing this option, he actually said, he told me really clearly that she has opted for a cremation that would cost less money, just because she internalised that burden that she didn't want to cost for those that she left behind. And she'd never seen a doctor for 40 years, had his aunt. But again, it brought home the idea of that internalised coercion or that internalised pressure and that mistrust, because he also talked about what happened during COVID. We had an interesting conversation, but I did say to him, it's interesting that he says that, and today I'm talking about it. And that is the reality of it, isn't it? It's about how people perceive healthcare provision, the potential inequalities, and what are the barriers for people to access, or the preconceptions or conceived ideas that we have about the provision of healthcare. Which also brings me to a potential third way, which is what this amendment is about: charities. One way of reducing the concerns we've just outlined are, certainly the concern that the honourable member has also raised, both the risk with private companies, the risk of loss of confidence and access to the NHS, as well as responding to the concerns outlined by the Royal College of General Practitioners. It could well be mitigated by ensuring the lead responsibility for administering assisted dying is given to charities rather than the NHS. I also think there's a strong argument that if we do have assisted dying services, they should be administered primarily motivated by public service. And before I take an intervention, that's not suggesting that doctors are not motivated by public service. I made it plain that I think it's not likely to happen if we turned assisted dying contracts over to Capita, Serco or G4S, for example. We know that most of the people who work in our NHS are absolutely motivated by public service, including doctors, as are most people who work in the charitable sector. That is not to say that either NHS workers or charity workers are faultless. But I do think we have to ask what happens if members of the public or press begin to say there are problems with an assisted dying service. In that case, who is more likely to ready to investigate problems and put forward solutions? People motivated by public service, or multinational firms potentially motivated by profit? And that speaks to the debate we've just had. My understanding of that debate, and there was lots of interventions, was yes, the member for Stroud talked about NHS commission service, but when we commission services in the NHS, we commission specialised services, but when we commission charities, they're not for profit. When we commission a mental health charity, etc. But when we're commissioning a service which is a profit-making service, it's not about the question, for me, it isn't about the doctors being, and certainly I wouldn't agree with the idea that doctors were corrupted in any way. What I would say, though, is that there is private healthcare providers, for example, there are profits to be made. And those profits do influence how things work in private companies. Honourable members could argue if the assisted dying service was turned over to the charitable sector, it would become underfunded by comparison with other NHS services. However, that argument doesn't wash, because if this bill passes, then it goes, well, I hope it goes without saying, or most certainly should do, that it would be a state-funded service, fully funded through the taxpayer. But I look forward to hearing what the Minister has to say on that, because again, in absence of an impact assessment, in absence of clarity of what model is being proposed, then I feel I've not been able to debate this and unpick this in the entirety that I'd have liked to. In conclusion, I'm setting out the case for supporting the amendment tabled by my honourable friend Paul Shipley. Thank you.
Rebecca Paul.
Thank you, Chair. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship today. I rise to speak on Clause Stand Part and new Clause 36, and in support of Kruger Amendment 525 and the Kruger Amendment to new Clause 36. This is a really important debate. The NHS is the greatest achievement of any Labour government, maybe even any government. It transformed quality of life for British citizens at a time of mass unemployment and widespread slums, ensuring free healthcare from, in the words of Beveridge, cradle to grave. The provision of free at point of delivery healthcare was life-changing and life-prolonging. As we have seen time and time again, the NHS is something that, although far from perfect, we as a country can be very proud of. The National Health Service, 1946, came into effect on the 5th of July, 1948. It was a direct consequence of the Beveridge Report, and in Clause 1 it says, and I quote, "It shall be the duty of the Minister of Health to promote the establishment in England and Wales of a comprehensive health service designed to secure improvement in the physical and mental health of the people of England and Wales, and the prevention, diagnosis and treatment of illness." So it was set up to help people get better, to live healthy lives, to give hope in situations where otherwise there would be despair. It was life-saving and life-changing. New Clause 36 turns all of this on its head. Subsection 4 states that regulations under this section may, for example, provide that specified references in the National Health Service Act 2006 to the health service continued under Section 1, Subpart 1 of that Act include references to commissioned voluntary assisted dying services. So, if this passes, the founding principles of the NHS are monumentally changed to include helping eligible people to commit suicide. That is what this new clause does. I'd just like to be really clear that it is entirely possible to support assisted dying, to want to ensure that a small group of people where palliative care can't help do have that assisted dying option, but to not support this new clause, which forces provision of the service through the same channels as normal healthcare. Assisted dying is not a medical treatment, it is not a healthcare service, and there should be a degree of separation accordingly. We should be incredibly cautious about incorporating the service into the NHS. This change will forever change the relationship between doctor and patient. It will breed mistrust and fear. It will discourage vulnerable groups from seeking the healthcare they need, and it fundamentally violates the Hippocratic Oath. Dr. Catherine Day, a senior partner of a large GP practice in Coventry, said, and I quote, "Trust lies at the heart of the doctor-patient relationship. I believe this trust will be shattered if patients consider that their MP may think that they should end their life and stop being a drain on our NHS." Sewan Seaman, a palliative care consultant, says, and I quote, "How could a terminally ill patient trust a doctor if they know that the doctor was prescribing medication to the patient in the next bed in a bay or cubicle with the intention of ending their life? Letting these assessments take place alongside other NHS services will irreversibly impact on patients' trust in healthcare professionals and negatively impact our therapeutic relationship with patients as doctors." Sarah, I will of course give you.
Just on the point that she's making, if she is saying that she wouldn't want to see assisted dying services within the NHS, where would she think they would sit? Would she support the Honourable Member for Shipley in terms of this should be done by the voluntary sector and charities, or would she suggest this should be done within the private sector?
I thank the Honourable Lady. So I think it's important that there's a degree of separation. But I would say to the Honourable Member, it would have made more sense for her to put forward a proposal that we could then evaluate, assess, identify the upsides and downsides, and then it would be much easier for me to come up with suggestions. I think to say to me, what is the solution, how would you do this, without having laid a proposal in front of me, I don't think that makes sense for me to lay out the many different ways this could be done. I will, of course.
I mean, there is a proposal laid before you, and that's what we're discussing, and I'll come on to that in my comments. But I'm just interested, she's very clear that she doesn't think this sits within the NHS. I just wonder if she must have given consideration to where she thinks it would sit if it were to come into effect.
I thank the Honourable Lady. So I will come on to some of that. And again, it goes back to, I believe there should be a degree of separation around. I think it should be separate from normal healthcare services, and there are multiple ways we could do that. And I really regret that we are not debating specifically the various different options with a proposal in front of us about exactly how it would work. And I'm assuming from the amendment put forward that the proposal is for this to go through the NHS as healthcare, because that's the only assumption I can make from what is in front of me in this bill, because there is no other detail to give me any other impression. So Sarah Davies, a consultant respiratory physician in North Wales, argues for a separate service so that ordinary NHS care is not associated with assisted dying. She says, and I quote, "It is already my experience that patients and their families are anxious about limiting treatment when they are dying. Many people believe that symptom control medications, such as those delivered in a syringe driver to aid symptom control, amount to hastening or bringing on death. This perception can hinder the patient's acceptance of medications which can afford significant alleviation of distressing symptoms." I've raised many times over the last few weeks my great concerns about providing an assisted dying service alongside and in conjunction with day-to-day healthcare. I think it's a massive mistake, both for patients and healthcare staff. It blurs the lines of what a treatment is. It increases the risk of bad decisions being taken. And as we have heard so powerfully from Dr. Jamila Hussain, it will discourage some of the most vulnerable groups from seeking essential healthcare. And there is so much written evidence that we've received that it's really important that we take on board. So I will be quoting quoting some of that in my speech. Dr. Green of the BMA says, and I quote, "It should be set up through a separate service with a degree of separation. We believe that it is important for patients because it would reassure patients who may be anxious about the service that it would not just be part of their normal care." He goes on to say, "It would reassure doctors because doctors who did not want to have any part would not feel that it was part of their normal job, whereas the doctors who wanted to go ahead would be assured of having support, emotional support and proper training." During oral evidence, Professor Preston argued for a separate system and pointed to the Swiss example. She says, and I quote, "In COVID, we did research in care homes and there was real concern about do not resuscitate orders and emergency care plans that were blanketed across the care homes. Care home staff were traumatised by that, so there are real issues. We know that there are real issues day to day in how people are treated within the NHS. I think it is unconscious. I do not think people are intending it, but we know that people are treated differently and that different things are done. That is partly why we think a system outside that would protect them, because then you are not within the healthcare team that is treating you and giving you advice about such things." She went on to talk about the Swiss system, which is also being adopted in Germany and Austria, where they seek to protect people by keeping it one step removed from normal healthcare. She says, and I quote, "Most hospitals in Switzerland will not allow assisted dying to occur because they do not want a lack of trust in their patient group." I therefore support Kruger 525, which amends the existing clause 32 to not allow provision of the assisted dying service to be done through the health services. That would ensure the much needed degree of separation. Although in recognition of what the bill sponsor has said, I do recognise that there are different ways to do this, and I'm very open to those different ways. I just need to see that degree of separation from normal healthcare. I also support Kruger new clause 36A, which does the same thing to new clause 36. Coming to the other amendments in this group, Dixon 537 and Olney 528 in particular, these are really important to debate, and we've obviously had some good debate on that this morning, as they raise the different ways of delivering an assisted dying service, and I have been listening closely to the points made. Under the former amendment, it's through charities, not the NHS, and conversely through the latter, it's through public authorities only. I don't have the answer on the best way to do this, and that's why I regret that a Royal Commission hasn't been set up to properly investigate and evaluate all the options and recommend the best way forwards. Instead, we are here, without all the relevant information and expertise available to us, trying to land on the best way to do this. This is not the way to make such an important decision. But what I can tell you, though, is like many others, and my honourable friend from East Wiltshire, I have huge reservations about delivering this service through the NHS alongside normal healthcare. I agree with much of the evidence already cited that there should be a degree of separation. The BMA say assisted dying should be outside existing care pathways. They think it could be part of the NHS but should in some way be separate. So they say, and I quote, "Our view is that assisted dying should not be part of the standard role of doctors integrated into existing care pathways. It is not something that a doctor can just add to their usual role." They go on to say, the separate service could take the form of a professional network of specially trained doctors from across the country who have chosen to participate, who come together to receive specialised training, guidance, and both practical and emotional support. They would then provide the service within their own locality, for example, in the patient's usual hospital or their home, or it could be a combination of some specialist centres and an outreach facility. The Royal College of GPs also proposed a separate service in written evidence. They said, and I quote, "The establishment of a separate service which covered every stage of the process would ensure healthcare professionals of multiple disciplines, including GPs, who wanted to do so could still opt in to provide assisted dying, but this would be arranged through a different pathway." I agree with both that it should be separated out in some way, and I think it's now apparent that my honourable friend for Runnymede and Weybridge, whose amendments would have created an assisted dying agency, was on the right track. I regret that the committee did not explore his ideas in any real detail during committee debates. Important written evidence from Robert Twycross, one of the pioneers of palliative care, who sadly died in October but gave permission for his friend Ariel Dempsey to submit it as follows. And I quote, "Twycross recommends a demedicalised model in which assisted dying is a separate service delivered outside of healthcare practice. He argues for a standalone department for assisted dying separate from the NHS. He writes, Data indicate that the primary reason for a persistent desire for assisted dying is to relieve distress over a perceived loss of autonomy and to experience a sense of personal control over the circumstances of their dying. These are not medical reasons. Thus, for patients fulfilling the legal criteria, a separate assisted dying service should be established. Indeed, this would be the best way to prevent the corrosive effect on medical practice generally. It goes on to say, given the widespread disquiet felt by doctors, a law with minimal medical involvement would be the most equitable. Twycross suggests one way to achieve this would be for assisted dying to be delegated to a standalone department for assisted dying, completely separate from the NHS and with its own budget. Victoria almost achieves this with its combination of care navigators, mandatory training for participating doctors, and a separate voluntary assisted dying statewide pharmacy service. Twycross emphasises that hospice and palliative care must be a sanctuary for patients, an assisted dying-free zone. Even in the absence of assisted dying, some people decline referral to palliative care despite unrelieved pain and or other distressing symptoms because they fear they will be drugged to death. This unfounded fear will be most likely be enhanced if assisted dying is legalised, particularly if palliative care is involved, and result in an overall increase in suffering. Now, Dr. Sarah Davies also says, and I quote, specialist assisted dying centres would be better placed to talk with the patient about the process and the potential complications. It would also be more likely that a specialist centre can procure the medications required. And she goes on to make the important point that in rural areas it would be difficult for the coordinating doctor to find a second doctor. She says, in a large city like London, this could readily be circumvented. In rural areas, then, this aspect of the bill is impractical and unworkable. This is another reason why I think specialist private assisted dying centres should be considered. The other point I wish to make is my concern around the imbalance in resources and the message sent out by including a fully funded assisted dying service within the NHS. Dr. Amanda Harlow in written evidence says, and I quote, the NHS is at breaking point. There are 16% less GPs in the UK than in countries with similar economies. Patients find it difficult to access both GPs and hospitals. Are patients who have requested assisted dying going to have priority over those who want to live? And retired clinical nurse specialist Claire McLaughlin says, and I quote, the NHS was set up to support people from the cradle to the grave, yet while our maternity care rightly receives 100% government funding, palliative care receives just 30% government funding. But if this bill becomes law in the future, we could have assisted dying that is 100% funded. What message does this send out when palliative and end-of-life care isn't fully funded and isn't provided ubiquitously? Why are we as a society happy to rely on charity shops selling second-hand clothes to fund it, whilst assisted dying will be fully funded by the NHS? Professor Nancy Preston, who also gave oral evidence in written evidence, co-written with another professor at Lancaster, Suzanne Oss, said, and I quote, our concern is the real risk that placing assisted dying within the NHS will communicate the wrong symbolic message when the majority of palliative care is provided through charities. I will give way.
Just a short point. She says that only 30% of palliative care is funded by the NHS, but that's quite spurious because all doctor time, palliative care consultants, palliative care departments, all GP services, all district nurse services, everyone who gives palliative care gives it under the NHS, and what she must be talking about is social care, which is obviously very different to medical NHS care.
Rebecca Paul.
I thank the honourable member for that intervention. So I am quoting written evidence, so I, of course, just quote it as written. We should be ashamed if this is where we end up as a result of this bill. How is this in any way recognising patient autonomy and giving them a real choice? It clearly isn't. We will end up in a situation where patients take an assisted death because there is no other alternative for dying well. If as much effort was put into improving palliative care as has been put into legalising assisted dying, we would find ourselves in a situation with much greater number of people being given the dignified, comfortable deaths they rightly deserve. It's a travesty that we find ourselves considering the introduction of assisted dying while hospices are on their knees and patients face a postcode lottery on receiving adequate end-of-life care. I will be voting against new clause 36 accordingly. Thank you.
Lewis Atkinson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. It's a pleasure to serve under you this morning. I rise in support of new clause 36, which I think sets out an entirely workable, appropriate and safe set of provisions for the Secretary of State to ensure that these services are provided across England and appropriate powers for Wales, though I'm far from an expert on those matters. This clause conveys powers to the Secretary of State to commission services free at the point of use in a way that is entirely analogous to the commissioning of other health services that are provided, as we know, by a range of different providers. Now, I do feel, perhaps it's, having come to this place, having been an NHS manager of nearly 20 years, that some of the debate here has slightly confused elements of commissioning provision and the way in which the NHS commissions and manages services. But I do think a couple of honourable members sort of made the key points. That my honourable friend, the member for Banbury, talked about the state must oversee and regulate the service, and I entirely agree. The fact that the commissioning powers sits with the Secretary of State absolutely ensures that is the case. The honourable member for Richmond Park said that the issue is who is commissioning, and again, we are absolutely clear the only person doing any commissioning in this is the Secretary of State, as potentially delegated into the NHS structures at the time. So that is absolutely clear. And just to paint a picture, the NHS is not, and the Secretary of State is not unused to commissioning services, highly specialised, sensitive services in this way. Indeed, I would be amazed if, when the Minister and the Honourable Lady stand up, they don't confirm that the government weren't involved in the drafting of this new clause to ensure that it is equivalent to the powers that are in the Secretary of State. So just to sketch out, I think, to committee members, this is clearly a specialist service. It is a new service. There is existing significant expertise and practice at high levels of NHS England and equivalent bodies of commissioning specialised services. The importance of the commencement period, which we will get on to discuss hopefully later today, is that the exact service specification, the engagement around that, will be drawn up in exactly the same way that it would be for a new cancer treatment or a rare disease, etc. And it is right that the time is taken and engagement done to come up with that. But fundamentally, services have to be commissioned. The idea sketched, I think, by some that this will be a free-for-all of anyone can provide and anyone will be paid is nonsense. There is no such obligation for the Secretary of State to do such or to reimburse anyone that decides they want to provide the service. So the service must be explicitly commissioned. And yes, I will.
Nice shot.
I thank the Honourable Member, my honourable friend, for giving way. I just want to understand, when he says it will be an explicitly commissioned, I completely agree with everything he said. One of the things of this service is this, by definition, will, as he's suggested, is a newly designed service. So does that not leave the door open for new providers, such as Circle, such as G4S, to then come in and design a new service and bring in the expertise to be able to deliver that? Is that not an option?
Lewis Atkins.
No, in the same way that G4S don't suddenly appear and provide, treatment to a new cancer service that the Secretary of State decides to commission under specialist powers. So I'm afraid, and I think we get into actually some of the arguments of opponents of the bill, trying to, I'm afraid, scaremonger on potential provision on this as a way of altering the second reading vote. Now, there is entirely appropriate ways, and a number of amendments clearly deal with the potential providers and whether they should sit in the public sector or voluntary organisations or indeed some private organisations. And in particular, I want to emphasise the point that the overwhelming majority of GP services in this country are private contractors. So it is inconsistent for members to argue that for anyone considering this, we should be absolutely maximising continuity of care, that the best safeguards against coercion and capacity are to have someone who has known the individual for as long but also to be arguing that someone's GP should not be permitted to be commissioned by the Secretary of State to play any role in this bill. So I suppose I challenge opponents on that matter. I will.
I'm grateful to him, and as ever, he's speaking very coherently in support of the bill and the principles of it, and I think he does regard assisted suicide as another form of healthcare, and therefore, as he says, it should be completely consistent with the normal duties of every medical professional. But can he just genuinely help me understand, does he envisage that this service would be provided by bespoke clinics within the NHS? Would established professionals set themselves up with the purpose of delivering this service, or would it genuinely be just something that any general practitioner would would provide through their own service? Does he imagine there will be specialists within the NHS whose sole job, or most of whose job, is providing this service?
Lewis Atkinson.
I thank the member for his intervention, and I hope to help him out in the points I'm about to make. I think what I would say to start, though, is throughout this bill we've talked about this being an opt-in model, and because of the requirements that we have rightly set out in this committee in terms of specialised training, etc., the idea that everyone is just going to be doing this. So I think there will be individuals, doctors within the NHS, etc., who are clearly, going to decide that they want to provide these services and will be developing specialism and appropriate regulation accordingly part of it. I think the other thing I would highlight is, I think it's clause 8(6)(c). We've explicitly required in our drafting for there to be a range of provision, because the second doctor must be independent, and the must requires in the drafting that they are not a partner of a colleague in the same practice or clinical team as the coordinating doctor. So the suggestion from some, either as a positive suggestion that there should be one organisation that's entirely separate that should do all of this, would not meet the requirements of Section 8C. But also the people trying to introduce the fear of one large organisation is going to set up and sort of take someone from start to finish on this is also not possible under this bill as drafted. Yes, of course I will.
Sarah Olney.
I'm grateful to the honourable gentleman for giving way, and I'm just reflecting on the intervention from the member for Stroud when I was speaking earlier, that the only payment that would be made under assisted dying would be at the very end, and therefore the doctors making an assessment at the earlier stage in the process, there was no possibility that they would be influenced. But now you're saying that actually, well, you're going to deliver, which is obviously what's implied by the draft, the different bits of the approval process separately. So clearly, whether this is a payment from the NHS or a payment from a private provider, the doctor making those different assessments is going to be paid at different stages in the whole process. Does he not agree with me that this points to the fundamental problem we have in this committee today, is that we do not have a proposed model that we can properly scrutinise? All of us are just talking about potential suppositions of how things might work, and effectively it's just a range of different straw men.
No, I don't agree with her, and I will tell her why. The reality is that the shape and nature of the health provider landscape is different from different parts of the country. So, for example, in Wolverhampton, there has been a significant amount of vertical integration where GP services are, in many cases, part of the NHS Provider Trust. So some amendments which would prohibit any public body from participating would explicitly prohibit GPs in Wolverhampton from provision. Elsewhere, a small number of hospices are provided by the NHS, directly by the NHS. Clearly, the history of the hospice sector in the UK means there is a very strong voluntary and charitable elements of provision, and that's entirely right. But that does vary from parts of the country. And coming back to the honourable gentleman's point from East Wiltshire, there are some hospices and end-of-life providers who have made it known that they would, if this law passes, that they may wish to explore whether they provide such services. But equally, others will not. And I think this goes back to the conscience debate that we had last week. There will be no obligation So you may well have a hospice in one part of the country saying, yes, we do wish to provide this service as an option to our patient, but a hospice in another part of the country saying we do not. And we need to not have a metropolitan mindset where all of these providers are within easy travelling distance from each other. Happy to give way to the Honourable.
Very grateful to the gentleman. He's making a strong point. Surely the heart of the disposition of the organisation should be consideration of the condition and the circumstances of the patient. So whether that's on the cancer ward, in the hospice or at home, the health service adapts and has adapted in all sorts of treatment to dealing with the different circumstances the patient it encounters. And we have to have a flexible enough system that will allow them to do that for this.
Lewis Atkinson.
The Honourable Gentleman is entirely right. And I think that patient-centric nature, explicitly commissioned by the Secretary of State, is why these powers need to provide for that, and to vary between the different parts of the country, not just in the provision landscape, but the services provided in rural Northumberland will, by nature, probably be different to those provided in London, and that is entirely appropriate. I'm happy to.
Danny
I'm grateful, and yet the irony of this measure is that it's not specific to the patient. You know, genuine healthcare treats the individual patient, their symptoms, their condition. This proposed treatment has nothing to do with the individual symptoms or condition of the patient. It just kills them. It's totally unrelated to the condition, which is why it's not healthcare. But to the Honourable Gentleman's suggestion earlier that somehow the bill ensures that the provision, the pathway is deliberately fragmented because the second doctor needs to be independent of the first, does he agree with me that, in fact, with that single exception, it would be perfectly possible for an independent provider to set up to provide the whole pathway of assisted death, with the single requirement that the coordinating doctor who would manage the whole process from beginning to end must get a second opinion from outside their organisation to sign the paperwork for the second assessment. With that single exception, the whole process could be managed by an independent, profit-making provider, commissioned by the NHS or otherwise, but managing the service entirely on their own.
Lewis Atkinson.
The Honourable Gentleman is, providing a masterclass in scaremongering, and I know that he needs Labour votes to switch before third reading, but that is absolutely, this service must be explicitly commissioned by the Secretary of State, and it is inconceivable that the Secretary of State will commission that in a way that the Honourable Gentleman describes. Of course, the coordinating doctor as one person is involved in the first assessment and the provision of assistance. Whether that is an NHS employed doctor or indeed someone else, it can only be one individual. But the safeguards that we've talked about, and this is before we clearly get on to the panel, etc., that the Honourable Gentleman spoke clearly against. So it is absolutely appropriate that the Secretary of State has the powers and indeed the duty to commission this service, and that they will do so from a range of providers, reflecting the differences. The other point that some members have made around regulation, I would again remind the committee that any provider will be regulated absolutely, not just under this Act, but by the Care Quality Commission in an entirely uniform manner. So I am confused, I would say, by the points made by opponents of the bill. I know we've had some saying there should be no provision on this by the NHS or any public body. We've got some others saying there should be no provision by charities, including presumably the local hospice, should the local hospice decide that is something that they wish to do. We have some, but not others, saying there should be no provision by local GP practice to provide continuity of care. So perhaps those different points reflect different ideologies within the committee deeper than this issue, but perhaps they also reflect that opponents of the bill just don't want this service provided at all. And the member for East... No, I'm going to finish this point. The member for East Wiltshire did a good job of reading a Bevan quote before, though I don't advise him to seek Labour Party selection with the gravitas in his voice as part of that. But actually, I think he's more genuinely not the heir to Bevan, but the heir to Bernard Brain. Bernard was the member for South East Essex in the 1967 abortion debate under the David Steele Act. And in Hansard, I quote, "The idea has been spread around that this, abortion, will be available on the NHS." And referencing the waiting lists, are our consultant gynecologists going to make that list longer by making beds available to those who want abortions? That is the tradition of objection that the Honourable Member speaks to in this bill, that just because he doesn't wish to have an option for himself, he does not believe that the NHS or that there should be free at the point of use provision for anyone else. So I will take back Bevan to this side of the chamber, as it were. Bevan said, "The essence of a satisfactory health service is that the rich and the poor are treated alike, that poverty is not a disability, and that wealth is not advantaged." At the moment, at the end of life, wealth clearly is advantaged. You do have choice at the end of life if you're rich and you're wealthy and you're able to go to Switzerland. Dignity and independence and autonomy should not be based on ability to pay. That's why we need to pass this legislation. That's why the powers set out to commission, as set out in New Clause 36, are entirely appropriate and necessary, and that's why I'll be supporting this amendment. Thank you.
Liz Saville-Roberts.
Thank you very much, Chair. And I rise to stand to Clause 32 stand part and New Clause 36 and 37. I would say that I think as a committee it is gratifying that everybody has taken so seriously the need to recognise where the powers lie in relation to the Senedd and Wales and Welsh ministers and Westminster and Secretary of State's here. And I think we're very aware that the evidence that we have heard from Professor Emma Lewis is that Clause 32 as it stands contravenes the Sewell Convention by giving the UK government powers of regulation to provide an assisted dying service in the NHS in Wales. And I'm, as I said, very appreciative of the way that we've been discussing this. Now, this is, of course, a private member's bill. In the nature of the subject that it is discussing, it is unprecedented, the nature of the subject, since devolution took place in 1999. And as we talk about these constitutional matters, and I talk about the Sewell Convention, it is absolutely important to remember what we are doing as a bill committee. We are trying to make sure that we tease out the questions in the environment in which all these services will be provided, and that we are giving people at the most vulnerable time in their lives the appropriate protection and the appropriate autonomy. And that is what we should always, always be balancing. Now, New Clause 36, as it relates to England, and New Clause 37, they certainly appear, and I use that word with as much generosity as I can, to clarify those responsibilities between Welsh ministers and Secretaries of State. My amendments went through this clause by clause and then put in a Clause 49 definition, rather than what we have here, which is a broad statement. Now, I do think strongly, although we've had debate on the contents of New Clause 36, it is not for us here in Westminster to specify how Welsh ministers may make provision for those areas over which they have responsibility. There will be debate, and I think it is appropriate that we have a debate, because then that also raises an awareness of the potential of a legislative consent motion, an LCM or LCMs. I think it is appropriate to have that discussion, and it is appropriate for us to be aware that there may be a discussion about the commencement date of this and the implications. That will come, I know, in another amendment further on. But these are the areas which we are discussing. But what I do appreciate with New Clause 37, because I'm looking particularly at Wales, is that this does what I have been attempting to do with my amendments as well, in giving us future-proofing, because we do not know, given that there is the most disaligned, if you like, the powers that have been granted to the Senedd of Wales are considerably different and less in their extent than those that have been granted to Scotland and those that have been granted to Northern Ireland. And there may well, in the future, be change. And this New Clause 37 allows for the potential of that change. I do still, because I want to put this on record again, I await further discussions. I understand that some have taken place, that there will be further discussions between Welsh ministers and the sponsor of this bill. It has already on record that UK ministers, Secretary of State, the member for Cheshire and Amersham and myself will have further discussions as we move ahead. There will be opportunities at report stage to make sure that we do what we are trying to do as committee members, which is making this legislation future-proof and to work as effectively as possible. But I think with that, I welcome these changes. New clause 32, clause 32 as it stands, does not recognise the constitutional arrangements of the United Kingdom, and it is important that we do welcome the intervention.
I thank her for giving way, and I thank her for the very constructive and collegiate way in which she's approached the Bill Committee, particularly when it comes to the issue of devolution. And I have made contact with the Welsh Government, and I am very keen to speak to them when the Bill Committee has finished, and they have said that they're very happy to do that as well, and I'm very keen to continue to work with her and other colleagues around issues of devolution to make sure we get this right for the people of England and Wales.
Liz Saville, Ron.
I appreciate the intervention. I appreciate the sponsors' comments. Nonetheless, I think that there is a lesson to be learned. I understand that this is unprecedented as a piece of legislation that comes through the private members route. We will, I think, after this, perhaps have to think about how we deal with this sort of legislation, because as it is, we are feeling our way. But I do appreciate the opportunity and the cooperation of colleagues in us trying to work together in something where we actually don't have a roadmap. And I fear, but also appreciate, that we are making the roadmap as we make it. Thank you very much, Chair.
Daniel Francis.
Thank you, Madam Chair. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairship. I really wasn't intending to speak today, but this debate has brought me to my feet, really, and particularly on the issues during that speech by the member for Richmond Park and my honourable friend for Luton South's intervention. It's 13 or 14 years ago now since my wife and I embarked on a road through IVF, which in fact never actually worked. Our children came naturally in the end. But I do know that pain that you go through and that despair during that process. And while I absolutely am not calling to question the efficacy of any doctor, of course, some companies, of course, in terms of profit margins, will always prey in that process. And that does come to the clarity, really, and I think by report stage, I hear we've had that discussion today about the regulations on new clause 36 and during the debate on the amendments. But I do think we do need some clarity at report stage. And I did refer to the annual fertility show that's held every year at Kensington Olympia. And I've checked, it is still held. I visited there about 13 years ago now. And that, to be honest, quite frankly, I have to say, coming out of that process, it is a complete marketisation process and does leave you, when you're already on your knees going through a process, where you are really depressed, feeling that people are partaking in a process simply to make profit out of you. So, you know, I've looked, you can book your tickets already for the event in May this year and navigate your path through that. There are expert-led seminars, as there were there. There are real stories where you can connect with people that have been through the process, wellbeing workshops, and over 70 exhibitors. And of course, all of those people are paying a fee to be there, and all of those people are obviously aiming to make a profit at the end of that process. You know, our first set of IVF treatment was free for the NHS. Our second, we paid £7,000 for, but again for the NHS. But after having been through a number of visits to NHS and private providers to assess whether we were willing to pay a top-up for a slightly better service. And I think what has brought to mind to me today during this conversation, as I say, I really wasn't intending to speak, was whether in that final part of the process there would be that upselling process, as has taken root in the fertility industry in this country. And all I would say is I think we do need some more clarity on that when we get to report stage. Thank you, Chair.
Now, Sean.
Thank you, Chair. And to save myself intervening on the member for Sunderland, because I had lots of questions, and he's actually confused me even more with his speech, because he pointed out to clause 8, in particular section 6D, in terms of the provision of the doctors being different. But if I'm right, healthcare providers such as Aspire, Ramsay Health could be commissioned to deliver these services, and in that case, as the honourable member from Wiltshire suggested, does that mean we need to have 2 separate doctors, if you like, or 2 separate providers, because the first doctor and the coordinating doctor and the second doctor can't be linked? That confuses me even further. And that, I think, what we've heard this morning, what strikes me about this debate is because we do not have any proposed model, and this hasn't been thought through, it speaks to what the idea that this isn't right. We are spending absolute hours and hours going through hypotheticals, possibilities. This could happen, that could happen, but nothing actually before us. Happy to give way.
Danny Kruger.
I'm grateful. She's absolutely right. I'm not sure there's anything in the bill that would preclude a private provider, Virgin Health, one of these sorts of organisations, from providing the whole pathway of the assisted death, including employing, though under separate clinics, separate practices, the 2 doctors who would provide the 2 assessments. So they would comply with the bill, but they might, in fact, be part of the same organisation, even if they work in different practices.
Nice, Sean.
I thank the honourable member for his intervention, and this is what's, I think, for me, there's 2 things that I've observed this morning. One is the reality has really hit home. Are we going to be looking at the amendment regarding local authorities providing it? Are we excluding private providers? Are we excluding big firms? It is a new service that's got to be designed. Is it going to be 2 people, two organisations? Is it going to be 1 organisation? Without the proposal of the actual how this bill is going to be delivered, that's the question. The actual delivery of what this whole bill is about. And we haven't even got that before us. And that concerns me deeply. Happy to give way.
Would she not agree, as my honourable friend, the member for Sunderland Central said, that this is actually common practice within healthcare and within the NHS, that services are commissioned in a range of ways? So you wouldn't put that level of detail on the face of the bill, but it would be normal practice for the Secretary of State to do that commissioning work. She's got her own experience of this, I would imagine.
Absolutely. And I thank the honourable member, my honourable friend, for her intervention. As a former commissioner, I'm very familiar with commissioning. I commissioned millions of pounds worth of services across Bradford when I was in the NHS. But here's the difference. The difference is that those are government bills that have had pre-consultation. They have an impact assessment before them. They have a model which is then debated. None of that has happened with this bill. And it comes back to the issue, when we're looking at new clause 36 and 37, in an ideal world, I absolutely agree that would be the right process. But without that impact assessment, without that consultation, without those, this, I'm afraid, just leaves me really, it's actually really disheartened me today to have, and I've also feel disheartened that we have done, and I thank all committee members, regardless of which points they've made and which they haven't, for all the way this debate has been conducted, both before this place and in this committee. And never have we used words such as, on a few occasions we've questioned, members have questioned, the reasons why people have put forward amendments. But to suggest that we're now scaremongering when people are actually really going through the detail, I'm afraid. I am not, this isn't me scaremongering, this is me being afraid for women who are anorexic. But this is a gendered bill for me. There are amendments that I'm supporting because I want to strengthen this bill. Because this bill as it isn't, I don't think it has that strength. I genuinely don't. And to talk about us, I feel disheartened, and I will move on, Chair, that we are talking about what's going to happen at the third reading and prudential votes when actually our concentration should be just the amendments and the amendments as written on paper. So that disheartens me. But moving on, I stand to oppose the new clauses, Chair, moved by my honourable friend Spen Valley. These new clauses would replace clause 32 in the bill as it was originally presented to Parliament. As my honourable friend has explained, new clause 36 outlines the powers that the Secretary of State for Health would have over voluntary assisted dying services for England. New clause 37 does the same for Wales, but makes changes necessary due to the fact that health is a devolved power. I will concentrate on new clause 36 as I represent a constituency in England. Put very simply, if this new clause passes, it will give the Secretary of State 3 sorts of power. This new clause will also give the Health Secretary powers under subsection 4 to effectively change the National Health Service Act 2006. It will also give the Health Secretary powers to set out regulations about how any service, whether public or private, carries out assisted dying services. The Health Secretary will also have powers under subsection 1 to commission assisted dying services. As I understand it, that wording means that the assisted dying services could be provided directly by the NHS or by private firms working on contract for the NHS. I would like to discuss those powers in order I have mentioned them. Subsection 4 of this new clause says that the Health Secretary may pass regulations which, and I quote, may, for example, provide that specified references in the National Health Service Act 2006 to the health service continued under section 1 of the Act include references to commissioned voluntary assisted dying services. I want to make it clear how this new clause works by quoting the subsection of the National Health Service Act 2006 that it would effect. That says, the Secretary of State must continue the promotion in England of a comprehensive health service designed to secure improvement, A, in the physical and mental health of people of England, and B, in the prevention, diagnosis and treatment of physical and mental illness. That Act is an adaptation of the original NHS Act passed in 1946. That Act said in the relevant part of its clause 1 subsection 1, it shall be the duty of the Minister of Health to promote the establishment in England and Wales of a comprehensive health service designed to secure improvement in the physical and mental health of the people of England and Wales and the prevention, diagnosis and treatment of illness. Both the 1946 and 2006 Act give the Health Secretary a very clear set of duties, which I think we can all support. Those duties have been the basis of how the NHS has been run for nearly 80 years, 8 decades that it has existed. But my honourable friend's bill would give the Secretary of State powers to change those duties set out in the NHS Act, first section. I would like to ask both the bill sponsor and both ministers, why does the bill need to give the Secretary of State these powers? The only reason I can think of is that someone who was part of the drafting process pointed out that the Health Secretary's current duties might be incompatible with assisted dying. The Health Secretary has duties to secure improvement in the people's physical and mental health, and in the prevention, diagnosis and treatment of physical and mental illness. Someone could bring a legal challenge saying that assisted dying doesn't fit with their duty, and that challenge might well succeed. I think that to prevent that happening, the bill sponsor has proposed this subsection of the new clause. If there is any other reason for why the bill sponsor has suggested we should give these powers to the Secretary of State, I think it's really important that this committee understands and hears why. I think this underlines just how major a change this bill would make. Since the NHS started operations in 1948, we have had a clear understanding of what it is there for. The 2006 Act is little different in that respect from the 1946 one. For nearly 80 years, we've had an NHS that is there to improve health and to improve how illnesses are prevented, diagnosed and treated. The fact that we may have to change that shows us that we are taking a very big step indeed. To make such a fundamental change to the NHS, we should have had the best possible evidence and proper consultation, not 3 days of witness hearings and then hundreds of pieces of written evidence, often published after we've finished discussing these topics that they relate to. That's nowhere near good enough. The next set of powers I want to talk about are mentioned in subsection 3. That says the Health Secretary, and I quote, may by regulations make other provisions about voluntary assisted dying services in England, whether or not the services are commissioned voluntary assisted dying services. I absolutely accept that if we have assisted dying services in England, then the Health Secretary should ensure that they are properly regulated. That will have to include privately provided services as well as those offered on the NHS. But I must ask, why does the bill say the Secretary of State may pass such regulations? The best interpretation I can think of is that the future Health Secretary might decide that private firms should provide assisted dying services directly to paying customers rather than via outsourced NHS contracts. In that case, the Health Secretary would need to provide regulations for those private sector services. But if that interpretation is correct, surely we could have tighter wording. The new clause could say, for example, that the Secretary of State decided to allow private firms to provide assisted dying to paying customers, then the Secretary of State must make regulations to govern that. I would welcome clarification on that point because I know that the member for Spen Valley has previously accepted an amendment. I think it was 477.
Order. It being 11:25 a.m, the committee is now adjourned until 2 p.m. Order.